and it has a small state mentality. Like if you live 20 minutes from Providence, you know, from your work, it's like, oh my God, you have to drive 20 minutes to work? Are you kidding me? You know, I mean, and people talk about it as the Rhode Island mentality, right? Well, we had the, again, this was the early 1990s, we had the second highest rate of out-of-home placement in the entire country, right? And my peers, my colleagues in you know, around the country or you know, at the NIH would say, Barry, what's wrong with you people? You know, you got the smallest state, you know, you got 1 million people. Why can't you deal with this? I mean, why is it that you're having such a big problem? And, you know, it turned out there were all kinds of reasons, and like you, we have mandatory reporting. And our mandatory reporting bill, I haven't seen your language, but ours is somewhat vague. And the wording is something like, there are many factors that may put a child at risk for abuse and neglect, such as, right? And, you know, they list a bunch of them, and, you know, one is prenatal drug exposure, and one is inadequate parenting. So it's somewhat loosely written, but most people interpret that as mandatory reporting. That's changed over the years, I think, as our attitudes have changed. And so we decided that we were going to try to do something about that. And I'm glad the judge is here, because one of the things that we eventually wound up doing was developing an alternative court system. Because our family court is relatively, let's say, punitive. It's not very friendly. And, you know, the approaches to prenatal substance abuse has always vacillated between punitive approaches and treatment approaches. And there's been this long argument about, you know, does treatment work? Is it effective? And, you know, that's a whole nother discussion. The short answer is yes. We know how to do this, we just can't afford to do it. But what we did was we set up a family treatment drug court, where instead of punishment, child removal, the judge mandates treatment. And so we write a treatment plan, and the judge mandates treatment. And it's a treatment with teeth kind of concept, where if the mom sticks to the treatment program, then you know, she gets to keep the baby, and eventually, you know, DCYF in our case, you know, backs out, and the mother gets essentially the baby back, and you know, reunification. It's not for everybody, but you know, it works, and for us it was a solution to trying to reduce the number of kids who were put into foster care, and we were able to demonstrate that that's effective. It doesn't work everywhere, and it's not necessary everywhere. From my conversations with the staff yesterday, it sounds like here you don't have that same knee-jerk reaction of prenatal exposure, yank the kid, foster care, which is again what was happening in Rhode Island. But
just so you know, we have one of two family preservation programs in the state here in Lafayette.
Cool. Well, maybe we can talk more about that. Yeah, I'd love to hear about it. So that, you know, it's abuse and neglect that this typically comes under, and then you know, like we also know that the presence of substance abuse in parents results in a threefold increase in the risk of child maltreatment, and these children are 3 times more at risk for early onset drug use. Now, that brings up another very, very important theme that we're going to talk about throughout this discussion, which is when I say they're 3 times more likely at risk for early onset drug use. What does that mean? Are we talking genetics? Because there are genetic predispositions. There are what we now call addiction genes, and there are genetic addiction arrays that you can look at and try and essentially figure out which kids are more predisposed or more vulnerable to addiction later on. But there's the big E, there's the environment, right? And so are we talking about genes? Are we talking about environment? Are we talking about the interplay between genes and environment? The short answer is yes. And we're also talking about a relatively new field called epigenetics, which I'll be discussing later, which to me is the most exciting thing since sliced bread. And I think holds the key to a lot of the mechanisms that are involved in the gene-environment interaction. I mean, I think it actually explains the gene-environment interaction. And we'll get into that. So, you know, again, just to go back a little bit in history and to go through the kinds of examples of how this has played back and forth and thinking about the implications on public policy. For those of you that were around in the mid-1980s and the war on drugs, you know, there were all of these early reports on prenatal cocaine exposure and just a huge public frenzy and myths about quote-unquote unfit parents and their damaged quote-unquote crack butt babies. And again, the impact on the legal system and on policy decisions. Again, child removal and prosecution was huge. And you know, you saw these headlines like cracks toll among babies, a joyless few, even of toys. Mother, I can't even see this well, mothers turned into monsters. You know, I mean, these were horrifying headlines. And there was a tremendous fear that these babies were destined to be brain damaged, severely impaired, institutionalized. And, you know, the media grabbed hold of this stuff, and that's why you had these scary, scary headlines. Most of this, in fact, turned out not to be true. The reason it turned out not to be true was because 2 reasons. One, most of the research was based on animals, rodents mostly, and the kind of work that you do with rodents you don't do with humans. So for example, when you're doing animal experimental research, what you tend to do is use doses that are hundreds and hundreds of times larger than the human comparable dose. Now, and so if you do that, yeah, you're going to find brain damage, you're going to find, you know, heart defects, you're going to find, you know, missing digits. But the reason the experimental animal researchers would do that, and you know, it's perfectly legitimate. I mean, they would say, look, I'm really not interested in comparing this to the human condition. What I want to do is see if there's an effect. And the best way to see an effect is to use a large dose, because the bigger the dose, the more you're going to magnify the effect, right? So that's what they consider their job, not to mimic the human condition. Not to mention the fact that in animal research, you really can't deal in a good way with the environmental aspect and the mothering and, you know, the rest of the factors that are involved. And the other problem was the early human studies were based on retrospective case studies, right? So your typical scenario would be, okay, we have a baby in the NICU and you're looking at the baby's history, and the baby has a lesion in the brain, and the medical record says that the mother used cocaine. And so you look at the record and you say, cocaine, lesion. The lesion was caused by the cocaine. Well, what else was involved? What else was involved here? And maybe there were other things that were involved that were associated with the cocaine that could have caused the lesion. But again, it was the knee-jerk reaction that you see the drug, and that's the cause of the medical problem, because these were retrospective chart reviews. So what happened was, the good news is that when an issue like this becomes important for public policy, and where we are now, by the way, with NAS and people calling it a national epidemic, you know, as bad as it is, it's going to translate into research, you know, and it's going to take a while, just like it did with, you know, cocaine, methamphetamine, and all of the other drugs that we used to look at. But it will mean there will be funds to study this program. There already are, and I'll tell you about that later. And so there'll be a lot of serious, well-done research, and ain't going to be tomorrow, but we will have answers and have a much better understanding of what's going on. So because of this concern, there were a lot of funded, you know, NIH, NIDA funded studies to look at prenatal cocaine exposure and do longitudinal follow-up studies and see what's going on. And when those studies started to come out, the story looked very, very different. And the findings were things like, you know, more headlines. A mother's cocaine use may not doom her child. Hope for snow babies. How do they come up with this stuff? It's just, you know, researchers debunked the myth of the crack baby. So the pendulum kind of swung from these kids are devastated to, maybe it's not so bad. And I think to some extent, you know, maybe the pendulum swung too far in the other direction, but that's the nature of science. Because one of the things that happened here, one of the unfortunate things that happened here, was it triggered some policymakers to say, oh, well then, why do we need to bother with treatment programs? Why waste all this money on these, you know, cocaine kids if they're quote unquote okay, right? So there was a real threat to treatment, intervention, and prevention programs. And, you know, I don't mind admitting that I was very much part of this. Where is it? Don't want to step, see, he's pointing at me, right? Yeah, major trial finds only subtle fetal injury from cocaine. I mean, that was our study. And I got a lot of phone calls. I got people, Barry, what are you trying to do? What are you saying? You know, and I'm saying, well, you know, this is what the findings are, you know, and, you know, we're trying to interpret them. And the term subtle effects is something that we started using in our publications and became kind of a buzzword because, what do you mean by subtle? Again, this gets back to clinical significance. What do you mean by a subtle effect? And are subtle effects important? Okay, or if they're subtle, meaning small, do we not have to worry about them? And the short answer to that is it depends on the population, all right? In fact, we published an article in Science in I think it was 98 or so, basically discussing the meaning of subtle effects. And, what we tried to point out in the article is that subtle depends on who you are. I'll go back to the example I used before. If the deficit is 4 points, it was actually 4.5 points. We did a meta-analysis, as in, I never meta-analysis I didn't like. I'm sorry. But so we did a meta-analysis, and the deficits, the IQ deficits, were about 4.5 points. Okay, if, as I said before, you're 4.5 points and you're talking about 92 versus 96, all within normal limits, so what? But these kids, their average IQs are in the 80s, right? So 4 points when your IQ is an 80 is enough to push you into qualifying for special education, right? You're now a standard deviation below the mean, okay? So a 4-point deficit in that context, it may be small, but it's very important because it's going to trigger the number of kids who are going to get EI referrals. So again, it's a matter of context. It's a matter of where on the continuum of normality do those subtle effects fall. So let's just look at prenatal substance exposure. I'm going to show you two studies, one about cocaine and one about methamphetamine. And the reason I'm showing you these studies is to drive home the point again that both of these studies are going to tell us the exact same thing, and these studies are going to tell us the exact same thing that virtually all of the prenatal exposure literature shows. And what they're going to tell you is that there are drug effects. There are absolutely clear-cut drug effects that can be isolated from other drugs, that yes, there are cocaine effects, yes, there are methamphetamine effects, yes, you can isolate those effects independent of the other drugs that women use, alcohol, tobacco, marijuana, okay, unequivocally. But the effects of those drugs are dependent on environmental factors. Okay, they don't occur in isolation. So if you take a drug-exposed baby and you put that baby in an inadequate, compromised environment for however you want to define that, poverty, inadequate parenting, domestic violence, we can, multiple out-of-home placements. If you have all those negative factors going against you, that child is going to have a worse outcome than if that child grows up in a positive environment. So maybe I don't have to go through this slide. So what this really all boils down to is that these prenatal exposures by themselves do not cause, quote unquote, brain damage. What they do is they make the baby more vulnerable. They make the baby more susceptible to environmental problems, right? Exposed kid, good environment, chances are they're going to do relatively well. Exposed kid, inadequate environment, chances are they're not going to do very well. So, and this is just an example to show you that, you know, most of the pregnant women who use illicit drugs, they also use alcohol, tobacco, marijuana. So again, on the bigger stage, if you ask not just, you know, how many cocaine exposed, how many this exposed, if you put all of the polydrug use together, you know, we're talking about you know, over 1 million babies exposed to illegal or illegal drugs in utero per year. And that's the public health problem. So this particular study is called the Maternal Lifestyle Study. It was initiated by the NIH itself. You know, typically when you're doing an NIH study, you know, you're the little investigator and you submit a grant and it gets reviewed, and 99% of the time it gets rejected. And but they're called investigator-initiated grants, right? Every once in a while, the NIH will decide that there are problems that are out there that are kind of too big for a single investigator to submit as a, you know, their own project. So, and they did this with the breast cancer study, a Framingham study. I mean,